For as long as I could remember, my father's voice had been the drumbeat of my failures. He didn't shout or hit. His cruelty was sharper, quieter. 5 years ago, after yet another report card that was good but not perfect, he had looked at me across the kitchen table, a glass of scotch in hand, and said, "Alex, you really are the family disappointment." Those words had settled into my bones, embedding themselves like a silent tumor. Every birthday, every family gathering, every fleeting moment of pride I had tried to feel was met with the same cold judgment. He had this way of making it seem like my existence was a minor inconvenience, an object lesson in disappointment for everyone around him. My mother, a quiet woman with her own fractured dreams, would avert her eyes, murmuring something about just trying to help. My siblings, meanwhile, seemed to dance around the invisible line he drew between me and them, careful never to step too close to his wrath. High school had been a minefield. Every achievement I celebrated, the scholarship I earned, the science fair I dominated, the art exhibit that got recognition, was met with a raised eyebrow or a dismissive, "Not bad, but you could have done better." I started to learn the art of silence, of shrinking myself, of turning my joy inward so it wouldn't provoke his disappointment. By the time I graduated, I was a ghost in my own home, a shadow moving quietly through corridors thick with unspoken resentment. And yet, despite everything, I craved his approval. I wanted to hear just once that I was enough, but the harder I tried, the heavier the words fell, like stones in my chest. The family disappointment, they were my legacy in his eyes, and they followed me into adulthood, insidious and unrelenting. After college, I left home. I built a life far from the shadow of his judgment, a life where people celebrated my accomplishments rather than sneered at them. I became successful in ways he could never have imagined, a career that earned respect, a circle of friends who valued me, a quiet independence that gave me peace. Yet, even miles away, even with the passage of years, the echo of his voice lingered. It was a phantom I couldn't quite exorcise, a constant reminder that no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough. It was a Monday morning when the invitation arrived, a crisp, cream-colored card embossed with gold letters, Dad's 60th birthday celebration. My first instinct was to throw it away, to shield myself from the inevitable humiliation of another performance under his watchful, judgmental eyes. But something stirred in me, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, not fear, not hope, something sharper. A promise. I stared at the envelope for a long time, thinking of every word he had ever said, every look of disdain, every party where I was treated like an inconvenient afterthought. And in that moment, I realized that I had changed. I was no longer the timid child shrinking under his voice. I had grown into someone capable of standing tall, someone who could confront the weight of those words, not with anger, not with tears, but with the quiet power of triumph. The 60th birthday party would be his stage, and perhaps if I played my cards right, it would finally be mine too. I folded the invitation carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket. The words "family disappointment" no longer fit. They belonged to the past, a past I was ready to rewrite. The days after the invitation arrived were a blur of careful calculation. I walked through my apartment, tracing my fingers along the spines of books I had collected over the years, photographs of places I had traveled, awards I had earned. All pieces of a life my father had deemed insignificant. Each one was a quiet testament to my survival, my success, my refusal to be defined by his words. I began to make plans, not the kind fueled by anger or revenge for its own sake. Those were easy and messy, but a strategy rooted in patience, subtlety, and precision. The birthday party was his stage, and I intended to turn it into my canvas. First, I thought about the people who had witnessed the dynamic over the years, family, friends, who had smiled politely at my father's cruel comments, my older cousins who had seen me struggle silently, even colleagues who had heard about my failure through family gossip. I quietly reached out to them, not with bitterness, but with the warmth of someone who had grown into themselves. Stories were shared, memories recalled, and slowly, a web of allies formed, people who would admire what I had become and quietly marvel at what he had overlooked. Next came the details, I researched the venue, imagining the perfect entry, the subtle glances, the unspoken contrasts between his expectations and reality. I practiced my posture in the mirror, not to impress anyone, but to embody the confidence I had always felt inside, but never expressed. I imagined walking through the doors, every eye on me, every whispered word amplifying my presence rather than diminishing it. I remembered every insult, every comment, every birthday that ended with him raising a glass to everyone else, while I forced a smile and clutched at invisible hope. But this time I would be ready. Every word, every gesture, every small accomplishment I had buried under years of shame would rise to the surface, carefully woven into conversation, a tapestry of proof that the family disappointment had never been real. It was just his failing to see me. I also allowed myself a touch of imagination, a playful sense of poetic justice. Perhaps he would realize for the first time that the child he had dismissed had outgrown the shadow of his approval. Perhaps he would feel the sting of absence, of lost opportunities, of years spent tearing someone down instead of lifting them up. I did not wish him harm, not truly, but I longed for acknowledgement, an understanding that his words had consequences, and that those consequences had been turned into something beautiful. Nights were the hardest. Alone in my apartment, I relived old conversations, old humiliations, and sometimes the anger bubbled up, hot and raw. But I let it pass like a storm at sea. Anger would have made me reckless. Patience would make me unforgettable. In my journal, I wrote down small reminders, mantras for myself. You are not the disappointment. You are the revelation. I rehearsed little anecdotes, little stories of my successes and kindnesses, imagining the subtle ways I could share them without seeming boastful. Every detail mattered. The timing, the tone, the glance that said more than words ever could. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of planning and quiet scheming, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and serenity. The child who had shrunk under his gaze was gone. What remained was someone whole, someone in control, someone who understood that revenge was sweetest when served not with cruelty, but with undeniable truth. By the time the day of the party approached, I was ready. My clothes were carefully chosen to project confidence without arrogance, my words rehearsed but natural, my mind sharp. I wasn't just attending my father's 60th birthday. I was arriving as a living testament to the person he had failed to see. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt the thrill of possibility, the quiet power of preparation, and the certainty that when I walked through those doors, nothing would ever be the same again. The night of the party arrived like a wave I had been waiting to ride. The mansion glimmered with warm light, the kind that masked old tensions and whispered elegance. I parked my car and took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of nerves and exhilaration. Tonight was not about confrontation. It was about revelation. I was no longer the child who trembled under his gaze. I was the adult he had spent years dismissing, and everyone else would see it too. The moment I stepped through the grand doors, I felt the subtle shifts in the room. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers started like currents running beneath the surface of polite conversation. My father's expression was unreadable at first, a practiced mask of neutrality, but I saw it falter for the briefest second. That flicker, almost imperceptible, was the spark I had been waiting for. Family friends approached with congratulatory smiles, compliments spilling freely. "Alex, you look incredible. I heard about your new project, amazing work." Every word was a brushstroke painting me in a light my father had refused to acknowledge for years. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in ages lingered longer than necessary, their admiration quiet but unmistakable. It was intoxicating, not because it was flattery, but because it was recognition, something I had starved for in my own home. The speeches began. My father, resplendent in his tailored suit, held the microphone like a king addressing his court. He spoke of accomplishments, of longevity, of pride, but never once mentioned me directly. I listened, my smile steady, my posture poised. I could feel the collective gaze of the room, shifting subtly. waiting for something to challenge the narrative he had spent decades building. Then came my moment, a toast, casually requested by an uncle who had always seen the tension in our household. I rose, glass in hand, and felt the room still. "I'd like to say a few words," I began, my voice calm, measured, and sure. "Tonight is about celebration, but it's also about reflection. Life has a way of teaching lessons, some gentle, some harsh. I've learned a lot from my father over the years, even if I didn't realize it at the time. All eyes were on me now, my father's included." He shifted in his chair, an almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw, a flicker of unease. "I've learned resilience," I continued, "the value of persistence, and the importance of carving your own path, even when those you love doubt you." I paused, letting it sink in. There was no bitterness in my tone, only truth, and it cut deeper than any insult could. I spoke of achievements quietly remarkable, anecdotes of kindness and dedication, little victories I had accumulated, while he focused on appearances. Each story was a gentle reveal, a tapestry illustrating that the child he had dismissed was now a person of substance, of integrity, of undeniable worth. By the time I finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat too long. I lowered my glass, smiled genuinely, and sat down. The whispers began, hushed but fervent. Eyes met mine with admiration, curiosity, and awe. And my father, he sat frozen, not angry, not dismissive, just unmoored. For the first time in years, the power dynamic had shifted. He could not erase what he had ignored. He could not speak past it. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to make him crumble. I simply existed in the fullness of my own truth, and that, I realized, was the most potent revenge of all. Tonight, I was no longer the family disappointment. I was the revelation he had failed to see, and the world had. The party continued around us, laughter and music filling the grand hall, but I sat in a quiet bubble of triumph. I had done it. I had spoken, revealed the truth, and in doing so, I had rewritten the story my father had told for years. Yet even in victory, there was no gloating, no harsh words thrown in anger. I realized that revenge was not about breaking him. It was about breaking free from the chains he had wrapped around my spirit. I watched him from across the room. His usual poise was faltering, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. The pride he had once wielded like a weapon now seemed hollow. He looked around, perhaps searching for reassurance from the other guests, but the glances he received were different now: curiosity, acknowledgement, a hint of wonder at the person he had ignored for decades. Family members approached me with quiet congratulations, gentle smiles, and small words of admiration. "I had no idea," one aunt whispered. "You've accomplished so much." Their voices were warm, sincere, and carried a weight I had never felt at home. Each compliment was a balm, healing years of unspoken humiliation. For the first time, I felt seen not through the distorted lens of his judgment, but through eyes that reflected reality. Later, I found myself on the balcony, looking out over the city lights, the cool night air brushing against my face. The soft hum of the party drifted behind me, distant but alive. My father appeared beside me, quiet for once, his presence heavier than usual. I could feel his gaze, though he didn't meet mine. "Alex," he said finally, his voice low and unsteady. I didn't realize. I turned to him, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in years. I saw something I hadn't expected: confusion, regret, a flicker of understanding that he had never felt before. I didn't answer immediately. I let him sit with it, the weight of his own words and years of neglect settling into his consciousness. "I'm proud of you," he added finally, but it was hesitant, almost a question. He wasn't fully ready to say it, not in the way I had wanted all those years, but the attempt alone was enough. It was acknowledgement, the first crack in the wall he had built between us. I smiled softly, without triumph or bitterness. "Thank you," I said. It was enough. I didn't need a full apology, not tonight. What mattered was that the years of being called the family disappointment no longer defined me. They belonged to him, to his mistakes, to the lessons I had learned despite him. I left the balcony before the conversation could deepen, returning to the party with a lightness I hadn't felt in decades. Guests looked at me differently now, not as the overlooked child, not as someone to pity, but as someone strong, accomplished, and complete. And in that realization, I felt the sweet, quiet satisfaction of vindication. By the end of the evening, I slipped out without fanfare, leaving behind the laughter, the music, and the echoes of my father's stunned silence. I walked into the night, the city stretching out before me like a promise. I had survived the years of criticism, the weight of cruel words, and the invisible chains he had tried to place on my spirit. As I disappeared into the quiet streets, I understood something profound. Revenge was never about making him suffer. It was about reclaiming myself, embracing my worth, and leaving behind the shadow of his disappointment. I had done it, I was free, and for the first time in my life, I walked tall, unburdened, and holy, unapologetically seen.